35 years now. Well, okay. And so it's really an honor to be back here in this parlor where I know we first visited in 1981 when Mom was looking for a church that was welcoming and affirming. And we didn't look any farther than here. So my name's Greg Russi, and in the 34 years that I practiced law in Colorado, I realized that we were seeing stories about the US Constitution in the news certainly every week, and sometimes even every day, more so lately every day. And I wondered, do we as a people have the constitutional literacy to be able to understand when we see a story in the news that's about something about the US Constitution, do we understand? Where did it come from? How did it get there? How does it affect our lives? And the reason that I undertook this project is we all own a piece of the Constitution. It's ours. It was founded by a group of people looking something like this in 1787 in a room in Philadelphia. And what I'd like to do is tonight tell you about the history and philosophy behind the US Constitution. Then next week, online only at 7 o'clock, next Thursday on Zoom only, we'll do the First Amendment, the first of the amendments of the Bill of Rights. And in 2 weeks, again online, we'll do the 14th Amendment, the most important of the Reconstruction amendments that came right after the Civil War. And the idea is that after kindling your interest about the Constitution, and by the way, Marilee Gibbs, our friend Marilee, was so good going out and getting copies from the League of Women Voters or ACLU or somebody. Anybody who wants a copy of the Constitution, they are here to hand out. For those of you online, there are many, many sites online where you can punch up the Constitution and read it there. And in fact, your homework for next week is going to be read the Constitution. It is remarkably brief, but for as short as it is, it's very compact. So you can skim it in an hour and maybe go back and read it again in another hour. Don't worry if you don't understand it. Obviously, the Supreme Court doesn't understand it either. Or else every decision would be 9-0. Well, there's a few 9-0 decisions, and that's when they say, hey, we understand this, but they don't understand that. Some decisions are splintered 4 or 5 different justices write an opinion. So obviously, if you don't understand it, you're not alone. But these are really handy, and it's good to have one. If you're a Constitution nerd like me, you'll have one in your pocket and carry it around, but it's good to have one around the house. So what I'd like to do is start with this picture. Even though this is a 238-year-old parchment, it still identifies many of the things that are in our culture today. It sets up our government. It has, through the First Amendment that guarantees free speech and freedom of religion, it guarantees a lot of the way we live our lives as Americans. So it is important that we stay up with it. And as it moves and changes with the Supreme Court's different decisions, it's important that we maybe take a look at that once in a while and see how does that affect our life. So the Constitution came from a meeting held in Philadelphia in 1787. This is a depiction of what one 20th century artist, his name was Howard Christie, thought that the 1787 Constitutional Convention looked like. And here you'll see some familiar faces. George Washington attended as a delegate from Virginia and was immediately elected as the presiding officer of the convention. Benjamin Franklin over here at the time was the president of Pennsylvania, and he would have acted as the host of the conference. In fact, Franklin hosted the Constitutional Convention in the very same room that the Declaration of Independence was signed 11 years earlier, as you know, which was written by Thomas Jefferson in 1776. The fact that these two men, Washington and Franklin, were the best known and probably most influential Americans in the day, lent a certain gravitas to this conference. it led people to believe that this conference had the legitimacy that it deserved and that they could go forward and do what they intended to do. And the reason these men met, and they were all men from the 13 states, was that, and the states were called states at the time, by the way. They had been colonies, as you know, but now they were known as states. The 13 states were somewhat wary and frustrated as to the many foreign powers that surrounded them. And they didn't believe that they really had an answer to what possibly could happen to them. And Marcy, if we could move forward 2 slides, let's take a look. Here is, a couple of years later, what would become the United States of America. At the time, Maine was part of Massachusetts and Vermont was part of New York. And you can see we're starting to cut out territories like Tennessee. Back here, West Virginia was part of Virginia. And there were less than 4 million people, including enslaved persons and Europeans. That does not include the indigenous folks who, of course, had been here long before us. Keep in mind that American civilization at this time was about 150 years old. Sometimes we tend to look at history like, well, there was Plymouth Rock, and then 20 days later, they drafted the Constitution. Somewhere in there must have been the Bill of Rights. No, I mean, it was 6 generations of North Americans had lived here in a European culture. But many people in these 13 states were very wary because here we have a Spanish possession throughout the South along the coast. And they owned and directed the Mississippi River. There were still French in Montreal and New Orleans. And the Brits still owned Canada. Down here in the Caribbean, the Portuguese and even the French were still swimming around in the area. And of course, there were pirates and a variety of other ne'er-do-wells who threatened the well-being of the country. But under the document that was governing the country at the time, which was known as the Articles of Confederation, these states had no central court system. They had no single currency. They didn't have a single post office or a uniform tariff law. They didn't have a system of banking or road building. They had no executive to make uniform decisions about how the entire country would go. There were little spats between the states over territory and resources. There was no foreign policy. There was no guarantee of receiving tax receipts, although there was a gentleman's agreement that some states would pay some amount of money, but they really didn't. And so what is often most often cited in the literature is they really did not have an army and a navy that they could depend on. So with there being no functioning central government, they had no way to protect themselves. And I think that the states had every right to feel insecure and wary about the future. The states were operating under these Articles of Confederation, which there was some agreement that they would be doing some sharing of legislative functions, but even that was breaking down. So in 1787, the legislatures of 12 states appointed delegates to the convention in Philadelphia. And they were just supposed to go down there and propose some changes to the existing agreement. Nobody told any of these delegates to go write a new constitution. And the 55 men who showed up were all white. There were no women. There were no indigenous persons. There were no enslaved or formerly enslaved persons. There were no people of color. The first thing they did, however, was tear up the old Articles of Confederation and write a new constitution. And as you see, and if we can go back to the Christie painting again, it's 2 slides back, thanks. As you can see, with Washington and Benjamin Franklin in attendance, confidence in these people that they could do that. This is what gave them the gravity to be able to do something like that. And one of the stronger proponents of a new centralized government was, in fact, George Washington. who attended as a representative of Virginia, and he supported a strong new centralized government. Can anybody take a guess as to why George Washington, of all people, would support a strong new centralized government?
Army.
Army. I heard Army. Anything else? That's the reason. If anybody knew how much blood had been shed and how much life had been lost in an effort to keep an independent and to establish and keep an independent government, it was George Washington. So he did write a letter to James Madison, who will be depicted as this guy. By the way, star of stage and screen, Alexander Hamilton is always in somebody's ear. Madison was a delegate from Virginia too, and we will talk a lot more about James Madison. He wrote a letter to Madison saying, you know, I think we need to do this. And he didn't quite hint, unless you really read between the lines, he didn't quite hint that they were ready to tear up the Articles of Confederation. But they must have all known it, because it didn't take them but a couple of days before they started working in earnest on the Constitution. They met from May to September in 1787. And what emerged was a proposed constitution for a central government, which they then sent out to the states for ratification. And if we can move to the next slide, please. What the Constitution does at a minimum is these three things. It sets up a government and identifies the major organs that will be a part of that structure of that government. It defines the relationship between the federal government and the states, and also the relationship between the federal government and we individuals. And most importantly, it identifies those basic fundamental rights for the people that are untouchable by the government. This is primarily, almost entirely in the Bill of Rights, which will come 2 or 3 years later. But this is a very important part of the Constitution, because it defines the relationship between ourselves and the government. And we'll see, and I hope,
Has everybody lost audio? Yeah.
Yes.
No, I can hear you.
You can hear me, but you can't hear the room, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. You may have, I put something in the chat, so hopefully somebody's monitoring that.
I just texted Marcy and Jasper.
Okay, great. Okay, so we've got it in the chat and we've got it through a text.
Yep.
That's good. Thank you.
Yep.
It happens sometimes.
I know, doggone it. He's interesting.
Yeah.
It looks like we're still connected though.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we are. And the fact that we can all hear each other. And we've also now lost the
So just we are back on, everyone. So thanks for your patience. Sorry, Zoom kicked us off. We're back on.
Okay.
unless there's a question, and if there is, just let me know. Do you have a question, Beth? Or somebody?
No,
No, it only cut
No
off
problem.
about a minute of your talk.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't
that's
know.
okay. We're back on. Let me go
We
ahead.
were talking about the Bill of Rights when it cut out.
Well, now we're talking about the history of the Tea Party and moving beyond that, then in 1775, we got the first shots of the American Revolution where there was a cache of ammunition and guns, which the Redcoats raided and the Americans defended, and some blood was shed and the war was on. And it would last from 1775 all the way over to October of 1781. In the meantime, the Second Continental Congress met and issued Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, which made it pretty clear that the Americans weren't going away and they weren't backing down. It ended finally at Yorktown when Washington accepted the sword from Cornwallis, but it took another 2 years to get a final treaty by which the colonies would become independent states, like city-states, like individual countries, but allied with one another. And during that time, well, what they did in 1783 really was Britain and France were settling all of their typical problems that they seem to have all the time. And the American Revolution, including what would now be what would become Canada, was set forth in that Treaty of Paris in 1783. The United States was represented by Benjamin Franklin, who did a yeoman's job of negotiating on behalf of the new country, as well as John Adams, who had come from England, where he was serving the Second Continental Congress, representing it before the Court of London. So we had these Articles of Confederation that I've told you about were not very effective. Finally, in 1787, Madison and all the others get together. They produce a draft and it goes out to the states for ratification. Ratification conferences were not to the state legislatures. It was to the people. It was to a group of people like us, sitting in a room and talking and debating and trying to decide whether this was a good idea and moving forward. They all passed it, some reluctantly, some very close. And many of the states that ratified the US Constitution as proposed did so only with the contingency and a promise from the founders that there would be a Bill of Rights, which came later. And we'll see why, before the end of today's lecture, why it was important that we get a Bill of Rights. By June of 1788, the ninth state, which was New Hampshire, ratified the US Constitution, and we had a country. Because if you look at the very end of the US Constitution, it says that when the ninth state ratifies it, we will consider ourselves to be a government. And then eventually all 13 states would do so. So in March of 1789, it took effect. In April of 1789, George Washington assumed the office of presidency, running unopposed and getting all of the electoral votes. And then December of 1791, we have the ratification by enough states that the Bill of Rights becomes law and it becomes part of the Constitution. And Marcy, if we could move to the next timeline. This is packed full of information, and we don't have time to go through it all today, but it's in your packets. You can read it at home, but here's what I want to point out. I call this the Ark of Self-Determination. It was like a project for Western civilization between the Magna Carta and the end of the 17th century, when we start to see the American project evolve. During this period, a number of things happen, and some of them, importantly, involve, at the Magna Carta stage, 3 or 4 of the ideas that eventually end up in the Constitution in 1787 are actually in the Magna Carta that far back. We see that the printing press comes along in the middle of the 15th century. None of this would have been possible without the printing press coming forward. And you may have heard that it was an immediate success. Immediately, there was a huge demand for books and pamphlets. People were sharing ideas. Education leapt forward. A paradigm shift in education occurred after that. People wanted to know things and they wanted to share ideas. Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation starts in the early part of the 16th century. Again, what Luther is doing, and this part of this comes from a series that Marcy did recently. What Luther was doing was showing that God didn't need the church to intercede between man and himself and itself. That people didn't need the church to intercede between themselves and God. And that is going to be an important political point too. The political point is we're beginning to see how man is shedding off the overburden of institutions, whether it's the Roman Catholic Church or later the monarchies, that man is beginning to evolve as a unit, as an item, as an individual. And as we move forward into the 17th century, this is the century where there's a tremendous amount of growth in science. The astronomers Galileo and his successor Newton come along and explain the universe in a way that the church never explained it. This is the environment into which the founders of our country were born 100 years later. And let's keep going. Very importantly, right in the middle of it all, Rene Descartes, one of the most important philosophers of the entire Western history, you know, he's the one who says, I think, therefore I am, the cogito ergo sum. Nothing could be more humanist and more rationalist than saying, I think, therefore I am. It doesn't refer to anything outside oneself. No institution, no God, no Congress, no throne, no church. Moving forward to Isaac Newton, more and more of the scientists of the day, the mathematicians of the day, are beginning to explain how the universe works. And what that does, Mark, you remember, is it draws the church's monopoly on mystery farther and farther down. Until this time, the church had a monopoly on mystery. If there was a question, how does this work? Why is there a sun? Why are there stars? The church had an answer. And now we're seeing that these, in one case, heretical, because Galileo, as you may know, was under house arrest for like 12 years. These scientists are coming forward and saying, you know what, it works differently than that. And this is how it works. If the church is no longer the monopolist of mystery, then who becomes the more important actor on the stage? It's the human being, it's the individual. And we move into an era where some of the political philosophers become very, very important. John Locke will be the most important political philosopher to help design the American experience, the American experiment. And he also has a lot to do with both the English Revolution at the end of the 17th century and the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century. And if we can move forward to, I recommend this to you not only because there's a lot of stuff. It took me a long time to throw this together. and I recommend it to you. Check for yourself if you agree that what we were really doing, what the project was all this period of time, was man becoming rational enough and responsible enough to govern himself, throwing off the shackles of the institutions, whether it be the monarchy or the church. Now let's go. Thank you. So the philosopher who influenced the Constitution most was, in fact, John Locke. Importantly, Locke dies in 1704. Benjamin Franklin was born in 1706. He is the generation, he represents the generation of leaders and thinkers right before the founders. All of our founders, everyone knew who John Locke was, and they knew what he said. And to boil Locke down to 3 or 4 points, he believed the government was only legitimate if it had the consent of the governed. We're going to read something here in about half an hour that's going to be a throwback to this point, so keep this in mind. Consent of the government of the governed is necessary in order for there to be a government under Locke's philosophy. He believed in the social contract. In order for government to have a thing to do, to have a legitimacy, it had one job, and that job is to protect the people. Well, protect it from what? In particular, to protect them from invasion of foreign forces, foreign armies, and so forth, but protect their property as well. From whom? From each other. Protect them from wild animals, protect them from health scares, protect them from natural disasters. It's why the city of Seattle fills potholes. It's to protect us from potholes. It's to protect us from what do they think government means? he used this tool called natural law to go back. Natural law was a tool that a lot of philosophers had worked with. They said it's almost like a frictionless surface. They said if you were to go back to when man was just man, there was just nothing but the family unit. What is his relationship to the universe? What's his relationship to God, to one another, to nature?
Yeah,
And
it's being recorded.
what natural law, what he did with this idea of natural law was he wanted to prove that we individuals have certain rights that existed before government ever existed. That it is not up to government to give us the right of free speech. We already have it. What we said in the Bill of Rights is government can't take that away from us. So these ideas of natural law were his, and he does refer to God-given ideas. He believes that man was born with rights of freedom of choice, freedom of religion, freedom of speech.
We're talking to Washington.
Later in 1776, when Jefferson writes
Jefferson.
the Declaration, we'll see that he borrows some terminology from Locke. He'll say, for instance, all men are created equal. And a lot of that goes back to this idea of natural law, because that's what Locke was talking about. I think that Locke probably meant this more as the idea of all men being created equal as an intellectual exercise, but Jefferson picks it up as a fundamental and substantial statement of philosophical law, which he embodies into the Bill of Rights, saying unalienable rights of life, liberty, and he substitutes pursuit of happiness. Locke talked about life, liberty, and property. Were those things that government is there to guarantee. Locke talks about both health and property, and all of this comes from his second treatise at the end of the 17th century. And if we can move on, I'm going to talk about one other philosopher that had a lot to do with the structure of our government, not so much the philosophy, but yet Baron Montesquieu, the French political scientist. This is kind of the beginning of the time, middle part of the 18th century, when we're starting to see politics become something that's boiled down to a set of fundamentals. And it's almost like a political science. What he says is our constant experience, and Montesquieu might be a little bit cynical here, but he says it shows that every man invested with power is apt to abuse that power. Every man is apt to abuse that power. And to carry his authority as far as it will go. And this tendency to abuse power can be moderated. It can be regulated and changed. We can live with it, but we got to do something to disabuse people who would be tyrants of the notion that they can govern that way. The constitution of the government and its laws, Montesquieu believed that in order to keep persons who are in power from abusing their power, there needed to be three legs to the structure of government. When the legislative and the executive powers are united in the same person or in the same group of judges, there can be no liberty, he says. And again, there's no liberty if the judicial power is not separated from the legislative and the executive. So he's arguing a three-legged stool. And I ask you, which of you wants to sit on a one-legged stool or a two-legged stool? Three-legged stool is most stable. This is the best explanation we have for why we started with this idea of separation of powers, which is continuing to be debated in this term of the Supreme Court. And the last term of the Supreme Court dealt with separation of powers extensively, because originally, and there were even some people before Montesquieu who talked about it, we learned that we've got to separate executive from legislative. And here, what he meant by executive was the right, or the power rather, to enforce the law. Okay, Marcy, if we can move to the next one. Nobody had more to do with the Constitution coming about than James Madison, who will become our fourth president. He is very close. He was very politically aligned with Thomas Jefferson. Madison was at the Constitutional Convention. In fact, he probably, if it hadn't been for him, there might not have been a constitutional convention. Jefferson was in Paris representing the Second Continental Congress before the court of France. Like many of the members of the Constitutional Convention, he was a slave owner. Almost half of them, 45%, were slave owners. He didn't go to William and Mary like many promising young Virginia men did. Instead, he crossed the river and went to Princeton over in New Jersey. Princeton was a flag planted by the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. And he learned the Scottish Enlightenment there. And many of the ideas that end up coming up back at us in the Constitution come from the Scottish Enlightenment and come through James Madison and others. He was a young legislator in Virginia, and as I said, was a primary moving force. And in the next slide, what we'll see about Madison is that he almost parrots what Montesquieu said about nobody who has power is happy with just the amount they have. They're always apt to abuse it. He says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. Cynical, but true. So he's an astute observer of human nature, and he was very interested in this idea of the tyranny of the majority. Now, I didn't used to understand this. I remember in 12th grade civics class, Tail Gunner Dream, and telling us all about the tyranny of the majority. And I didn't really understand it, but now I think I do. If one faction, and we'll talk about what a faction is in a minute, if one faction were to completely possess all branches of government, all the organs of government, then it will move forward to disenfranchise its enemies, people who oppose it. Therefore, it was necessary, according to Madison, and he's following up on Montesquieu for some 30, 40 years earlier, to neutralize these factions of society from invading the rights of others who are less franchised, maybe disenfranchised. A faction could be anything. It could be economic, religious, or geographic, or other distinctions, professional distinctions. It might be people from New England. It might be fishermen. It might be folks who own slaves. It might be people who farmed barley as opposed to people who farmed wheat. It might be folks who went to a certain church. But in any event, it was important that somehow we find a way to not allow one group to run all the levers of government. And then to the last slide about Madison, he said also the government must check itself from becoming too powerful. And that's how we get this idea of checks and balances. It comes right out of Montesquieu's idea of separation of powers. There has to be some sort of tool in the Constitution to where the three branches of government check one another. They invade one another's powers a little bit. This lecture, we're not going to be able to go through what all the checks and balances are, but veto power, for instance, is one. Overriding a veto is another. And there are really literally dozens of them buried down in the Constitution, where one party, one branch can essentially, in some small manner, regulate the other two branches. And again, here we see the ghost of Montesquieu coming through Madison. Once again, all men having power ought to be distrusted to a certain degree. And then as a result of that, we get one of the more fundamental ideas in the Constitution, separation of powers into the three branches and checks and balances. So let's move on and take a look at what actually is in the Constitution. This is an outline. In these booklets that you have, you'll find that there are 7 articles and now 27 amendments. Of the 7 articles, every word in there is important for some, in some amount, but Article 1, 2, and 3 each deal with one of the branches of the government. We'll start with the legislative branch, and then they go to the presidency or executive branch, and then the federal judiciary or the court branch. Why do you think they listed the legislative branch first?
Make the laws?
Hmm?
They make the laws?
It does make the law, but they could have put it anywhere. Why did they list it first? And the answer merely was that they thought that it was important to point out that this was the people's branch. This is the branch closest to the people because it would have it could be changed every 2 years by the people. There were a
Question,
lot of-
uh,
Yeah, question, go ahead, please.
yeah, am I correct that at the time that the Constitution went into effect, the House actually was, as you just said, directly elected by the people? The Senate, I think at that point was being elected by the state legislatures?
Absolutely correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to go back to answer your question, as you just said, it's the most, it's the branch that has the most direct connection with the people.
Exactly. And there were some voices that said, well, we ought to reform the government every 20 years or every 100 years. We ought to have a new constitution. And the answer that Madison and others had for that was, if we have an opportunity to replace Congress as a whole every 2 years, as well as a third of the Senate, it's like a rolling revolution. Every 2 years, you get a new Congress. And to some extent, some people will always get thrown out of the old Congress and new voices will be elected to reflect the environment of the day, political environment of the day. It wasn't until the early 20s during the progressive movement that people demanded that they elect their senators directly, and the state legislatures no longer did so. By the way, the rest of these are very important as well. There's a lot of very important stuff down in here, like, for instance, the fact that the states may not have a foreign policy. You'll find that in one of these two. I think it's the 4th article. And we'll concentrate on Article 5 about the amendment process in a minute. Any questions before we go forward from this group online, anybody at all?
This is Barbara again, and I have a question which is maybe not directly related to this, but again, I don't know exactly when this happened. I don't think it was at the time of the Constitution, but I believe that first off, I know about quite a bit about the Constitution myself because I tour programs about suffrage. But I seem to recall that at the beginning of the country, at the beginning of when the Constitution was in effect, the United States was referred to as the United States of America are. No, yes, the United States of America are something, something, something. Whereas now we generally say the United States of America is.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it became a
have you
singular
encountered that?
thing.
Have you encountered that sort of the transition between what we had under the Articles of Confederation, which was, as you said, city-states, independently, states. But at some point, and I don't know when it was, I think it was sometime in the 1800s, that the thinking changed. I don't think it was legislative or anything. I think it was just.
Yeah. Well, you're absolutely right, Barbara. That was a metamorphosis. It was a process that took a long time. At the time of the Constitutional Convention, people did not see themselves as North Americans or as Americans. They saw themselves as Pennsylvanians or New Yorkers or Carolinians. They were, and their ancestors had been of this colony or of this state for many generations. And then it became a country. The United States is a country as opposed to 50 separate states. So if we can move forward to the next slide. The most revolutionary part of the United States Constitution is in the first 3 words, because for the very first time, and we touched on this for a minute, but for the very first time, what we see is that government is not being handed to the people by a monarchy or a church or a military group or a dictator or a political party or a militia or a group of outside states. It's not being handed to the people by the Roman Catholic Church. Again, the consent of the governed meant that we, the people, would establish the fundamental precepts of the government, including the foundation of it. So where have you seen this before? Probably in John Locke, where John Locke says you got to have the consent of the governed, and that's where the social contract begins. And he talks about all of these ideas. This is the only really kind of poetic part of the Constitution. Until you get to the First Amendment, the rest of it is pretty precise, dry reading, but it's very important. This kind of sets forth, it's like a mission statement. Okay. Well, it was important to it was very important to the colonists and the initial North Americans who made up the United States not to repeat what they had had before under Great Britain. They did not want another George III. They certainly did not want another parliament, who they disliked even more than the king. And therefore, they insisted that the powers of Congress be limited. Powers of Congress could be only what it is that the founders said the Congress could do. And as we hinted at, there's another half a page after this, but let's take a look at this one. Because anything that Congress wants to do, even today, must come back to some point in Section 8 of Article 1. At some place, it's got to be something that was provided for by the US Constitution. So, for instance, a couple days ago in the Supreme Court, you may have heard there was a case about tariffs. And the executive saying, well, that's the president's power. But a lot of people say, no, it's Congress's power. And where do you suppose that came from? It really is the very first words of Section 8 of Article 1. That Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes and duties. Right there it is. That's tariffs. Duties, imposts, and excises. So at some point, just to answer the inevitable question, Congress has entered into a few laws that does vaguely give the executive a little bit of power with regard to tariffs. And this executive has tried to, I think, expand that power. We'll see what the Supreme Court has to say about it. So in terms of making this relevant to us, and this group here and online obviously is attended because you believe the Constitution is relevant. And here it is. 2 days ago, this word was being argued in front of the US Supreme Court right here. And the idea was, and if you at home can't see it, I'm pointing to the word duties in the first line of Section 8 of Article 1. The idea being that Congress must find some authority for everything it does, and the executive's authority is not the same. Remember, Montesquieu told us legislative must be separate from the presidency. And here's a long list of things that you would want your government to be able to do: to borrow money, to have a uniform law of bankruptcy, to coin money, to punish counterfeiting, and so on and so forth. By the way, God does not make it into the Constitution, but science does. Right here, we see that to promote the progress of science and useful arts, there should be essentially a copyright patent office. And if we can, for a moment, go to the next slide, Marcy. This is the end of Section 8. Interestingly, the power to declare war, it belongs to Congress. And so does the right to call forth a militia and to discipline that militia and to set up the District of Columbia. But then there's some loosey-goosey parts to Article 1, Section 8, some open-ended provisions. And we talk about how it's all, scholars like to say, oh, well, the Congress only has limited powers and Congress can't do anything but what it's limited, it's allowed to do. But then we look at these three great big clauses, these open-ended clauses in the US Constitution. And I play this little game called limited power or no limited power. I ask you, what do you suppose this means? To make laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Does that sound like limited government to you, or does it sound like a blank check to do anything they want? And if we can go backwards, Marcy, I'm going to show you not one, but two more places where the founders left pretty big holes. They talk about Congress having powers to provide for the general welfare of the United States of America. Well, there's an awful lot of things that come up where Congress just says, well, we're going to do that because it's in the general welfare, even though you haven't told us that you can do it. Well, there's nothing in here about the Environmental Protection Agency. There's nothing in here about the Interstate Commerce Clause. I'm sorry, about the Interstate Commerce Commission. There's nothing in here about the Department of Agriculture. So Congress has utilized these kind of open-ended terms in order to expand its authority to a point where we have to ask sometimes, are there really any limits? And the answer is, yeah, a few, but not a lot. Here is the third of the wide open clauses, and that is the power to regulate commerce among the several states. This is called the Interstate Commerce Clause. The Interstate Commerce Clause was huge when it came time to promise and regulate civil rights and civil liberties. Civil rights laws were all passed under this Interstate Commerce Clause to regulate commerce between the several states. So know that your Congress is a creature of limited powers, but those limits are a little bit open-ended. If we can go forward a couple of slides. One of the most important parts of the UN Constitution is Article 6, Paragraph 2, the Supremacy Clause, and it says that the US Constitution and federal laws are the supreme law of the land, and any other law that contradicts it or conflicts with it will fall second to it. So if there is a state law that says one thing and the federal law comes along and says something else, federal law will govern. Any questions about the Supremacy Clause? It's in there. Sometimes we have to deal with it whether we would like to or like it or not, because states are really closer to the people than the federal Congress is. And sometimes we want our states to regulate certain areas, but they can't because the federal government says, we're already regulating this area. And when we choose not to regulate it, it still means we're regulating the area. You can't have a state law that comes up and takes a part of it away from us. We can move forward.
Honey, can I?
Yeah, Mom.
When did women get votes?
Oh, well, women got, you know what? We're going to cover that in just 2 more slides, okay?
Okay.
That's a good question, and we're going to cover that. In fact, women got the vote because of the power of the people to amend the US Constitution, and that ironically is where we are right now. The amendment process to the US Constitution is very, very difficult. It's only been used 27 times, including the first 10, the Bill of Rights. And then there was one time in American history where we passed an amendment that revoked an earlier amendment, repealed an earlier amendment. And can you think of what that is? Dad knows because he was born in 1933,
Prohibition.
the year of prohibition being overturned. The proposed amendment has to be passed first by 2/3 of both houses of Congress and then by 3/4 of the state legislatures. Right now, that's 38 state legislatures. So in order to stop an amendment, we just have to find enough state legislatures so that the side that is the proponent of this amendment can't get to 38. And that's why it is so hard to amend the US Constitution. There can also be a constitutional convention, which has never been called after 1787. Why not? Because it would be open for all intents and purposes. Anything could come up. You can't just have the constitutional convention for one thing, like to, for instance, allow a certain procedure or not allow something to happen. It would be open for everything, so it's never happened. There's a reason it's so difficult. Anybody want to hazard a guess as to why it's so difficult? It goes hand in hand with Madison's idea of tyranny of the majority. He says, if it were easy to amend the Constitution by the drop of the hat, then any time that one faction, one political party, for instance, got a hold of all 3 branches of government, the first thing they would do is gore all the oxes owned by the other side. That can't happen when these super majorities, 2/3 and 3/4, are required in order to amend the US Constitution. Hey, Mom, let's talk about how many times the Constitution has been amended to include voting rights. And that's the next slide. And you might have to expand this one a little bit. One area that the United States people have used to amend the Constitution several times is to expand and to include groups who were not included in the original Constitution with regard to voting rights. Disenfranchised communities. Starting in 1870 with the 15th Amendment, which gave folks who had men who had formerly been enslaved the right to vote. Voting extended to men regardless of race or previous condition of servitude. Then it took 50 years after, and there were suffragettes at the time who wanted to be included, and it should have happened at the time, but of course it didn't. Another 50 years goes by before we get the 19th Amendment in 1920, and there's the answer to your question. In 1964, the 24th Amendment was passed, which eliminated poll taxes. And this was the first time that certain people who had been excluded from voting, and a lot of times these were uneducated women in certain parts of the country who had been turned away from the polls because they could not pay a poll tax, were allowed to vote because it eliminated the poll tax. And then in 1971, many of us remember when the voting age was lowered to 18. So here were 4 disenfranchised groups that people have used the amendment process to include. By the way, the first states to allow voting on state issues were
Correct.
in the 1880s, it was Wyoming, then Colorado, then Utah and Idaho. Can any of you tell me why those states, those Rocky Mountain states, would be the first in the 1880s and 1890s to allow voting by women on state issues?
I could make a stab at it.
Property owners, there's one guess. What? Ah, yes, there's that. And then I heard something from Zoom. Tell me again.
Well, I was just going to say that in some of those states, at least, there were a lot of women, or they wanted a lot of women. So, and it's also difficult to maintain the putting your women up on a pedestal when they're out there chopping the wood and all of that.
That was really the primary reason is these states they had plenty of men, they needed to attract women. And to show them the respect they deserved, these state legislatures gave women the right to vote. A lot of women did show up and some of them became political leaders. So let's
Could I
move
add-
forward.
Could I
Go
add
ahead.
something?
Yeah.
A lot of states and territories also gave, or women won the vote. Sometimes they lost it either through the courts, or in the case of the Utah territory, they lost it through a bill in Congress. So yeah, there was a lot going on.
Right, it did change a couple times in Utah before the 19th Amendment in 1920. That's an unfortunate footnote to
Well,
history.
Actually,
I just want to make a time check. We're almost at 8 o'clock, so I'm
Okay.
just going to move us on,
Let's
okay?
go to the last slide.
Yeah.
Last couple, 3 slides. So the executive is in Article 2. These are the powers of the presidency. Well, as I showed you in the room at the Constitutional Convention, there was this big, tall, well-known guy named George Washington. Everyone knew that he would be the first president of the United States, or else they were at least hoping he would. He told everybody he wanted to go back to Mount Vernon and raise tobacco, which is really what he wanted to do. But he was impressed upon to become the first president. And as a result, Article 2 is very thin on the regulations that apply to the presidency. The president doesn't have a lot of things to do. He's supposed to give a State of the Union speech every year. And down here, we find that he is to take good care that the laws be faithfully executed. That's the enforcement power of the Article 2 presidency, is that he is to execute the laws, meaning enforce the laws. And he does that through his, through his cabinet officers, which are called here the department chiefs. There's not a lot required of the president. And so when a president comes forward and said, I'm going to do all these things, what he's really saying is, I'm going to enforce these laws in a manner that I see fit, rather than I'm going to install a bunch of new laws. He might tell you that, but he really doesn't have that authority. And let's move then to, I think the last slide is about the judiciary. In Article 3, the judiciary, the Supreme Court is given truly nothing to do. How did it become so powerful? And by the way, it's 9 unelected people who form like this mini legislature that serve for life and can almost never be taken out of office. It turns out that the Supreme Court, in fact, had virtually nothing to do until 1803, when it gave itself a job. It gave itself a thing called judicial review. And it did that in a case called Marbury versus Madison that you may have heard of. Can't go into the facts with you because it was a very complicated fact pattern. It takes forever to talk about. But what they said was, we have the power of judicial review. We will say when a law that comes out of the legislative department is unconstitutional. And we will say when an action that comes out of the presidency goes beyond his or her powers. And so as a result, what we see in the balancing of the scales is, and I'd like you to kind of consider the Constitution when you read it in terms of powers and authorities of government, rights and liberties of individuals. People really don't have powers, they have rights and liberties. Government really doesn't have rights, government has powers. And the obligation of the court is to balance governmental powers with individual rights. Obviously, it has to also do things between private parties like contract law and that sort of thing. But what a Supreme Court oftentimes is prepossessed with is balancing powers and authority with individual rights and liberties. So that is the end of the slide presentation I have for you tonight. I would like you to read the US Constitution before next Thursday, if you would. We'll have plenty of time for questions and answers next week. And we've got plenty of time, I think, right, Marcy?
Yeah.
For questions and answers right now. And then I'll also have an article for you to read next week as we get ready for our 14th Amendment discussion in 2 weeks. So I guess what I would say in conclusion, and I thought I had some really adroit concluding remarks here. Let me see if I can find them. That the Constitution is not perfect. It certainly isn't. There are a lot of gaping holes in it. In fact, as you'll see, if you keep reading in constitutional history, the founders kicked the whole idea of slavery down the road. And what we found out was, 80 years later, we had not only the worst war we have ever had, but at the time it was the worst war that ever happened in the world. It also didn't deal with the issue of women's rights and women's right to vote, which it could have dealt with at that time, but it just simply wasn't being proposed by the 55 men who showed up to write the Constitution. Sometimes change is formal. It's done through the amendment process. Sometimes change to the Constitution is informal. It's done by the Supreme Court when it reinterprets laws, and sometimes even reinterprets it to the point where it changes what it did 49 years ago. Okay, I think we're at the point where my prepared remarks are done. And I'd love to take questions from you from the floor and from
So then
online.
maybe let's start with anybody on Zoom who has a question that you haven't had a chance to get addressed yet.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
first of all, thank you.
yeah, you're welcome.
And I know nothing about the law, but I get the impression that sometimes precedent is set by a case. And then that precedent can be changed by a subsequent case. And I'm curious, specifically with the poll tax, was that something that was actually in the Constitution? Or was that a law that somehow got established and they felt it was necessary in the Bill of Rights to clarify that law It's not consistent.
Well, these are two different ideas, and let me address each one of them in turn. Mark brings up this word precedent, and precedent with a C, not president, but precedent is the tool on which the Supreme Court and other courts are supposed to rely when they're determining what is the law. We talked about judicial review, something that the court gave itself in 1803 after Marbury versus Madison, and what the court uses as its tool to determine what will the law be in the future, how will we resolve the conflict between two different laws, is it relies on cases it has published in the past. When there's a case before it that issues an opinion, the opinion can be read by anybody, everybody, all of us. Those opinions become a bank of law and they become the precedent on a certain issue. When new facts bring about a new fact pattern and a new conflict, the court looks to the precedent, something similar, to see if it sheds some light on the discussion that is before them. Now, with regard to the poll tax, that isn't something that was an amendment to the US Constitution that the people passed, rather than the Supreme Court doing. What had happened was that, as you saw, maybe we should go back to that green slide that has the 4 voting amendments on it, back 3 or 4. As we saw, regardless of race, men got the vote in 1870, and then all adults got the vote regardless of gender in 1920. But yet there was a group of states who continued to discriminate against individuals. Oftentimes these individuals were the sons of daughters of formerly enslaved people. And we called this era Jim Crow. And Jim Crow, I don't know where the name comes from, maybe somebody does, but Jim Crow is an era that lasted about 100 years, basically from the 14th Amendment that we'll learn about in 2 weeks, in the 1860s, till the Civil Rights Laws and the 24th Amendment in the 1960s. It took about 100 years for the federal government to start enforcing the law that had been set down by Congress in the 1860s. And one of the things they did, among many horrible things, was prevent people from voting by making them, they had 3 or 4 tools. One was a poll tax. They would make people pay $2 or $3. Folks didn't have $2 or $3 to vote. And as a result, they would just stay away from the polls forever and always, and all of their kids, generation after generation. One was a literacy test. There's absolutely nothing in the Constitution about having to be literate up to a certain level. And this was especially wrong in places where sons and daughters of formerly enslaved people were denied education. How could they pass a literacy test? And then there was a thing called the grandfather clause, which some states said, well, if your grandfather couldn't vote, then you can't either, in direct contravention of the 15th Amendment. But unfortunately, there was this period you may have learned of laissez-faire, kind of late 19th century rule where the laws just weren't enforced. And a lot of this was in the South, but not all of it was in the South. A lot of places, Blacks, people who were otherwise persons of color, and some of them were simply folks who were poor, simply did not have access to the polls. And that got changed mostly here by a groundswell of demands. I mean, this was at the time Martin Luther King was marching. What about this? This happened because of the Vietnam War. Here's another group of people who were not allowed to vote. We were drafting 18-year-olds and sending them to Asia. And if they came back, they still weren't allowed to vote. At the time Nixon was president, and even he said, these people ought to be allowed to vote. And that passed pretty quickly through not only Congress, but then however many states had signed on, obviously 38 or more. So this is a tool used by the public to exercise its demands when they are more or less uniform. It's like got to be a supermajority to pass an amendment.
So Greg,
Yeah.
how does that all fit in with the supremacy clause, the Jim Crow stuff?
Yeah, they ignored it. Right. So what Beth is asking is, if the supreme law of the land says voting is extended to men regardless of race or previous condition of servitude, And then a state says, well, we're going to make everybody pass a literacy test before they're going to vote. That's in direct contravention of the 15th Amendment. But when, one of the most torturous things to do if you're reading constitutional history is to read the US Constitution, the US Supreme Court's rulings between 1860 and 1900. Things like Plessy versus Ferguson, things like the slaughterhouse cases, where time and time again, points like yours would come up before the Supreme Court and they would find a way to say no. It's enough to make you want to stop reading constitutional law. I know I did it for a while and put this project aside for a while. It was so painful that I couldn't believe it, but things have slowly changed since then. Yeah. Yeah.
But weren't there just 7 members of the Supreme Court
Yeah.
until recently?
Not until recently. I think the 9-member court. So the Constitution says nothing about how many people sit on the Supreme Court. The original court, I think, was 5. And at one point it ballooned up to 11 and it was 7. And now it's been 9 for a long time. A lot of people think that that's in the Constitution and they say, oh, no, you can't pack the court. You can't change the court. Well, it's not in the Constitution. It is a matter of legislation.
So how did that one?
Well, the Congress would have to pass a law. There is a part of the Constitution, I believe it is in Article 3, that says that Congress is allowed to pass laws that regulate the Supreme Court. Again, it's one of these checks and balances. There just isn't the political will to do it right now. It has been there in the past.
Would term limits on Congress require an amendment?
The answer is yes. And I'm trying to remember exactly what the argument is. The answer is yes. Term limits on the Supreme Court absolutely would, because it specifically says in Article 3 that members of the Supreme Court will serve during good behavior, which means for life. Yeah, term limits on Congress would have to be in Article, it would have to be an amendment that would be read together with Article 1.
And the Electoral College would have to be an amendment.
Absolutely, because it's already there, and to change it, you would have to amend it. By the way, the Supreme Court has struck down laws that Congress passed to change the Supreme Court's own interpretation of the US Constitution. So the Constitution's there, along comes the court, they say, well, this is what it means, blah, blah, blah. And the Congress says, well, that's not what it means anymore. We say it's this. And the Supreme Court has at certain times said, no, you can't do that. We've already told you this is what it means. A law cannot change the Constitution. Only we can tell you what the Constitution means. At various times in American history, every one of the branches has been considered too powerful. Many people right now think the presidency is ascendant, but then watch what happens with this tariffs case. I think you're going to see a change in course, and maybe the judiciary will extend itself for a while into the public sphere and become more powerful. Looks like there's a couple other. Diane.
What was the reasoning to allow the Supreme Court to be for life?
Yeah, so the question is, what was the reasoning to allow the Supreme Court to be for life? And I don't know what went on in the Constitutional Convention, but afterward in one of the Federalist Papers, I'm pretty sure it was Alexander Hamilton who wrote that the Supreme Court justices are so busy doing the right thing and finding the law that they shouldn't have to worry about being renominated or reelected or, yeah. But the easy answer would be, well, just let them serve a 7-year term and they maybe could be reappointed one more time, perhaps. But
In 10 years.
Yeah. But the founders didn't think of that. Yeah. The Federalist Papers, by the way, is a very good place to find what the law means. They were written primarily by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, who by no means were friends. They were willing to cooperate, but one was a Democrat and one was a Federalist. One was from Virginia and one was from New York. They hardly agreed on anything, but they did get together and publish these letters for about a year and a half after the convention to try to convince primarily the state of New York to come on board, which it did right after New Hampshire. Is there one final question before we break? Anybody else? Well, thanks very much for wanting to come out and learn something more about your US Constitution. You own a piece of it. And what I say at the end of every one of these classes is, here's to your Constitution.